Fabulous. Right, okay. Very good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's research methodology module. Today I'm going to introduce you to the world of research methods, and I'm going to explain how we can start to structure a research project or a research undertaking. Now, by default, research itself, it's problematic because you're starting off with a great unknown, okay? When you're doing research, if you knew what the outcome was going to be, then it wouldn't actually be a research project, firstly, because research is all about unearthing, understanding, digging beneath the surface. It's about exploring things, okay? So if you already knew the answer before you started, then it's not necessarily a research project, okay? Research isn't linear. It isn't like doing a mathematical equation where you already know what the answer is going to be. You know, 2 + 2 in research can equal 5. It doesn't always have to equal 4. So research methodology is quite an interesting course because it allows you to structure your research, allows you to understand how different approaches, different philosophies, different ontologies, and different epistemologies all come together to influence how we understand A, the world around us, but B, how we make sense of things that are happening. So depending on your outlook, you may be more qualitative or quantitative. These are all concepts we'll discuss over the course of the next 2 lecture series. But that then also means a lot of different things for how you approach your research, the methods that you use, and how they contribute to the outcome that you achieve in your research project. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Akmal Sunner. I've recently graduated from the University of Strathclyde, looking specifically at innovation ecosystem strategy, but research methods is fundamental, particularly at PhD level, because you have to go into a lot of detail to explain your grounding, both from a philosophical, but also from an ontological and epistemological positioning. So I'm very, very familiar, and hopefully I can share some of my knowledge and experience with you over the course of the next 2 lectures. So what are the objectives of this module? Well, I want you to be able to understand how you formulate a research question, okay? Some people just come up with a question and say, I'm going to research this, and they go ahead and do that. Now, it'll be wrong of me to say that, you know, that's not correct, because it may well work for them. They may well do something that's useful, or they may well produce something that adds some value. However, in order for us to guarantee that at least our starting point is structured, our starting point has got an anchorage, it's got a point that we can say, here is how we got to research question, that gives you validity, okay? So when you're producing a piece of research, whenever someone reads that, they want to see, can it be replicated? Is it something that if I was to try by myself, using the instructions you've given me, I would get a similar result, if not the same? So again, in order for us to provide validity, to provide credibility to our research, we need to demonstrate that we followed structure. We've actually structured our approach. We've actually got a method that's underpinning how we got to the research question. So you might think the research question is starting point, but I'm going to reframe that for you today. I'm going to say the research question is actually a milestone on the way to completing a research project. So your starting point is actually before the research question. There's things you have to do to get there. I also want to feel more comfortable with the research process. Now, I don't know how familiar any of you are or have been over the past few years of your education around research methods. Perhaps you've done dissertations or thesis in the past. Perhaps you've undertaken research in your organizations, and you know, each company has its own methodology, which can be different to academic methodologies. But the point I'm trying to make here is I want you to feel like the research process isn't scary. Yes, it's a structure. Yes, it's got steps that you need to follow. And yes, it can be time consuming, but it's not a scary process. It's about understanding how you can go on those steps, undertake that research process 1 step at a time, and then produce something that, when brought together, is a robust and reliable piece of research. I also want you to understand the ideas of constructs and operationalization. Again, I'll explain these more as we go along, but there is a way in which we can understand concepts that sit within the research world, and constructs and operationalization of constructs is something we will touch on. Finally, I want you to understand the major differences between quantitative and qualitative approaches of research. So again, I spoke earlier about, you know, depending on your approach, you might take different methods, you might take different approaches to your research. Well, quantitative and qualitative are very much at the opposite ends of the scale. Okay? Sorry, someone's not in mute. Can I just ask you to go in mute, please? Okay, apologies. So yes, depending on where you sit on the scale between qualitative and quantitative, if you're at either end, you're very much polar opposites, you're extremes. However, the vast majority of cases I've seen most people sit somewhere between that scale, okay? So if you imagine a spectrum between completely quantitative to completely qualitative, the majority of people are not at the extreme, they're somewhere in the middle. And that's something we'll look at in terms of how does that influence, how does that outlook then deter or change your approach to research and how you approach what you're doing. So this is a quote from Albert Einstein. So I'm sure all of you are familiar or have heard of who Albert Einstein is. So he said that, you know, if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research now, would it? So this kind of comes back to the point I was making at the very start of the session today. When you set off to do a research project, you shouldn't know the answers. There should be a number of different questions, a number of what ifs or buts, or, you know, number of unknowns. If you don't have any unknowns and you have a very good idea, or you think you already know the answer, then you couldn't really call that research. That's you almost writing a story. That's you almost telling me, I know what the output's going to be. I know what the end result's going to be. I'm just going to fill in the blanks between now and then. That's not research, okay? So in order for you to do pure research, you need to almost go in blind. And that sometimes can be scary, okay? Going in without knowing what the outcome's going to be, without knowing, you know, whether or not you'll achieve what you want to achieve is a scary process. However, I want you to be more willing to accept that, because the best research projects, the research that actually adds value, the research that actually uncovers new concepts, new ideas, tends to be that type of research, okay, where someone has gone in, they wanted to investigate something they didn't know, they didn't have an answer to it, they couldn't explain how something works, and they wanted to research it. That's how they found new things. That's how they found out how things work. It's how they've been able to make sense of what they're doing. So research is all about trying to uncover or undress what is not known, okay? It's the unknown. What can we discover about the world around us that we don't already know? So what's the meaning of research? Well, basically research is an endeavor for you to try to discover answers that are both intellectual, but also address the practical problems that we face in society through the application of a scientific method, okay? So another quote here from Redman and Morey: research is basically a systemized effort to try and gain new knowledge, okay? So when I kept saying it's a process, it's a series of steps, so Redman and Morey agree with that. They're saying it's a system, okay? So it's a way in which we approach research. It might not be the only way, but it's certainly a systematic way that can be replicated, that allows you to claim validity, to claim robustness and reliability in your approach to your research. The research is a systematic process of collecting and analysing information. When we say information, we mean data, okay? So that's something I want you to be careful of as well. When you're collecting and analysing it, it tends to be raw data. In order for you to increase your understanding of the phenomenon that you're trying to understand or you're concerned with, okay? So again, that's the process of research. And the reason it needs to be systematic is, well, imagine this: if I were to sit here in front of you without having done any study, without having done any teaching qualifications or experience, then yes, I might still sit here and tell you things, but what I'm telling you probably wouldn't be accurate. It'd probably be me guessing, or me trying to make things up. Whereas me, having been through the education process, having done teaching at different levels, having taught undergraduates, postgraduates at different universities, I'm able to then provide you with a certain degree of reliability. You trust what I'm saying. If I was to come and sit in front of you as someone without any of that educational background, without any experience, you wouldn't trust what I'm saying. So the research world is very, very similar, okay? If you don't follow a systematic approach, if you don't have structure to your research, then what you produce no one will trust it. People will look at it with a very broad sense of this probably isn't accurate, or this probably isn't robust, this probably isn't a reliable piece of research because this researcher hasn't followed any structure, they haven't actually adopted any models of doing research. Okay, so that's why it's important that we give structure to what we're doing in the research world. So again, sticking with the research theme, because a lot of people sometimes get confused as to what research is. I think it's important to clarify this early on. It's basically a process of finding a solution to a problem through the study and analysis of situational factors. So what do I mean by that? You're looking for ways to answer a question, to find answers to an issue or a problem that you might have identified. And how you're going to do that? Well, you're going to analyze something, whether it's through interviews that you carry out, whether it's case studies, whether it's surveys, whether it's quantitative numbers and data that you gather. Irrespective of how you do it, you're going to use data to get to the end product, which is answering a certain question that you've set yourself. So research itself provides us with the needed information that allows us to guide in the practitioner world, managers, to make informed decisions. It also allows other researchers to then take on what you've done and try and explore it further, try and grow what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, when you're doing a piece of research, your focus is usually quite narrow. You can't investigate everything, okay? If you're investigating a particular industry, a particular area, a particular way of working, then that's a very specific context, okay? That's based on the sample that you've chosen. Someone else might want to expand that. Someone else might take your research and say, okay, you've done this, let me change something, let me try something different and see if the output's the same. So again, with the research world, researchers will want to use your research to guide their own thinking, but also to allow them to test what's been done already. So again, it's important that we have structure in place so that that can be done. We want to allow the future generation of researchers to take what we've done and to expand on it, okay? The information provided could be the result of careful analysis of data gathered either firsthand, i.e. primary data that you captured through interviews, etc., or perhaps is data that's already existing with the company. So you might look at company reports, you might look at financial information that's been published, you might look at existing databases. So again, information might already be there, you might not have to gather it as primary data yourself, but there's different ways in which you can collect that information, whether it be first-hand or primary through your own interviews, case studies, your own field notes or observations, or whether it be secondary information that which has already been published, already been collected, perhaps for a slightly different purpose. So why do research then? Okay, so I've talked a little bit around what research is and what perhaps some of the process might look like, but what's the objective of it? Okay, so what? Why do we do it? Well, basically, as I said already, you want to discover answers to scientific procedures. So the objectives of that then is for you to gain familiarity with a phenomenon. You want to understand that phenomenon that you're investigating. You might not be able to pick out why something is happening the way it's happening. You might not be able to understand why something reacts or acts in a certain way in a particular context. So again, you want to gain familiarity with what's going on in order for you to achieve new insights. And that type of research is known as exploratory or formulative. So that tends to be things that you want to explore, okay? Things that perhaps aren't already well explained, or things that perhaps aren't currently well understood because they're still quite new. So those types of research are called exploratory or formulative research. In other cases, you might want to portray accurately the characteristics of a particular individual, situation, or group. So again, maybe something's been in existence for a little while. We maybe have an understanding of how it works, but we don't know the impact of it on a particular group of people. We don't know the impact of it on a particular organization or a particular situation. So what you might want to do in that case is do what's called a descriptive research, where you very much focus on the application of a technology, a change management program, it could be anything at all really, something that's been implemented, something that we know does work, but we don't know the impact of it. We don't know how it influences certain populations. We don't know how it might change certain elements. So for example, bringing it into the real world, and coronavirus, for example, at the moment, we've got COVID vaccines. We know that the vaccines do have a good reaction against the virus. They help our bodies fight the virus. But what we don't quite understand fully yet is the long-term side effects that may come with consuming the vaccine, or the long-term side effects of having the virus. These are all things that people might want to start exploring from what we call a descriptive approach, which is looking at it to understand how it's impacted a certain group of people, how it's impacted people in a certain geographical area, how it's impacted people that have had the virus versus those that haven't had the virus. How have their bodies reacted to having the vaccine? So again, these are all things that you might want to investigate under a descriptive study. We then have what's called diagnostic research. Now that's basically where we try to determine the frequency with which something occurs. Okay, so here you're looking at how often does something happen, or how does that thing happen more often in one area compared to another. This is mostly a statistical based study. So diagnostic research tends to be mostly to do with statistics and dealing with frequencies and numbers and means and averages. These are all things you would tend to look at with diagnostic research. And then finally, you've got hypothesis testing. So hypothesis testing is where you try and test the relationship between a set of variables. So again, the variable might be the amount of time spent watching TV and the IQ level of the individual. So again, these are two things that perhaps aren't always directly related, but you might think there's a relationship. You might think, okay, if people are watching more TV, perhaps they're not reading, perhaps they're not learning, perhaps they're not spending time increasing their knowledge, therefore their IQ might be lower. So you pose a hypothesis, okay? You would say that one of the things you want to test is whether or not high consumption of watching TV programs leads to lower IQ, etc. Okay, so that's what we call hypothesis testing. It's where you set a hypothesis, and then the purpose of your study is to test whether or not that hypothesis holds true. In that context, you'll probably do experiments. So hypotheses are usually tested using experiments. So again, this is your objective, okay? You're doing a study, but how you're doing it is the objective of your study. What do you want to achieve by doing it is also the objective. So are you going to explore something, describe something, diagnose something, or if you're going to test a hypothesis, test a guess? Hypothesis is basically an assumption, okay? An assumption that you're making, and then you then want to test that assumption. But again, you have to be logical. Like if you told me that the amount of time you spend drinking a coffee correlates with how many times the Earth spins around the sun, then that's not really a direct relationship, okay? That's not sensible. You need to be able to prove that there's a causal link between what you're investigating with hypothesis testing. So what are some of the characteristics of research and what makes research important? Well, firstly, research is directed towards the solution of a problem. Whenever we're carrying out research, our main goal, our main aim is to try and give an answer. We want to provide a solution to the issue, the research question, the problem, whatever it is we're investigating. Okay, the whole purpose of research is to try and give an answer. It's based on what we call observable experience or empirical evidence. So depending on what type of researcher you are, you might want to base it on what you're seeing, what you're hearing, the sensory stuff. That tends to be more qualitative research. So it's more about what's being observed, what's being heard, what's being felt by people. Or you might base it on empirical evidence. Now that's more quantitative. This is people that are concerned with cold, hard facts. They just want numbers, they want data that proves or disproves. So empirical evidence is very much factual. It's yes and no, black or white. Whereas observable experience can be quite subjective. It's people's opinions. My opinion of something might be very different to your opinion of something. So what's to say that I'm right or you're wrong and I'm wrong? So again, it's about understanding how people's opinions shift and change and how those combinations of opinions perhaps locate somewhere within the truth, okay? So observable experience is all about the qualitative stuff. It's all about understanding what people are saying, hearing what people are doing or saying, and trying to make sense of a situation. Whereas empirical evidence, it's all about the cold hard facts. You want to deal with numbers, you want to deal with cold hard data that proves or disproves something. Now, research demands accurate observations and description. So again, Although I've said already that observations can be subjective, which is true, research still demands that we capture them in a transparent way so that they're an accurate reflection of what we're saying or what we're seeing. So if you were to see someone dancing, but you wrote on your research that they were actually crying, then that's not accurate. Okay, you've not captured the accurate emotion, you've not captured the accurate picture of what happened. So again, with research, one of the things we have to do is to make sure we're being true to A, ourselves, but B, to the rest of the research community. If we're making something fabricated or we're lying about a certain fact, then that can impact the outcome of our research. So we need to be clear and transparent with everything that we capture, whether it's observed or whether it's described or understood based on numbers, okay? And research itself then involves gathering new data. Now that usually comes from primary sources, such as interviews, such as surveys you might carry out, such as your own personal observations. If you're observing people doing a piece of work or you're observing people behaving in a particular way, that's all primary research, okay? That's based on you going into the field and gathering information. However, sometimes you can use existing data for a new purpose. So perhaps data was already gathered for a slightly different purpose, but you might decide, okay, that's still useful because I can use that information to collate for my study. So for example, the government every 10 years in the UK does the census. So as part of the census, they gather information based on people's age, their geographical location, their job profile, their health, lifestyle, etc. So they gather some information about the individual, and that's obviously used for governmental purposes, but it's also published after, I believe, 20 years, 25 years. So if you were maybe wanting to understand the lifestyle changes of people in the UK between the year 1950 and the year 2000, you might want to look at the census that the government publishes and understand how people have changed, how the age profile has changed. So again, you can use existing information that's already published for a particular purpose and use it for your own study. That is okay as well, that's allowed. Now, research activities are characterized usually by designing or by carefully designing certain procedures. So what do I mean by that? Well, you need to be able to show basically a paper trail of what you're doing. When you're doing research, it's not simply enough to produce the final report and say, here you go, here's the outcome. That's not what people want. People want to see how you got there. And for that, it's really fundamentally important that you have a well-designed and a well-explained research process. As I've said already, research requires some degree of expertise. You need to have certain skills to carry out an investigation. Now, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes. We're not looking for you to solve murder crimes or anything, but we need you to be able to understand that there are certain skills required for you to carry out a research piece properly, okay? You need to have good listening skills, good analytical skills, good skills in interpreting information, good skills in writing and disseminating information. These are all some of the relevant skills that go into putting together a piece of research. Research is objective and logical. Now, again, you might think, well, that's a bit hypocritical because I just said some elements can be subjective. Yes, what you're capturing might be subjective to the individual that you're talking to. So, you know, if you were asking me in an interview particular questions, the answers I give you may well be subjective to me, but it's your job as a researcher to capture them in an objective way. So you shouldn't be judging my answers. You shouldn't be changing my answers based on what you think is accurate or based on what you think I'm saying. You should be keeping what I've said there, the cold, raw, hard material. The evidence should not be tampered with, okay? What I've told you should be what goes into your research. You shouldn't try to change, or you shouldn't try to misinterpret, you shouldn't try to change what I've said to fit your narrative. So again, we need to be objective and we need to be logical as researchers when we're dealing with information. Why is that important? Well, we want to test any possible reason for why something has happened in the way it has, and we want to validate that, okay? So if we're changing the facts or if we're misconstruing or we're purposely construing something in a particular way, then automatically we're influencing the outcome, and we don't want to do that. In research, we have to be completely objective. We're third parties. We don't want to be directly involved in what we're researching. We just want to capture what's going on. Research involves the quest for answers to unsolved problems. So again, that just repeats what I've been saying already. Research, you shouldn't know the answer when you start off. If you already know the answer, or if you think, this is going to take you down a particular path and you're already plotting how you're going to write up the answer, then you're not doing true research, okay? You're not being true to yourself, and you're not producing something that's going to add any real value, because if you already know the answer, that means most other people can probably guess it as well, because they must have similar types of knowledge to you. So again, with research, if you're going in without knowing the answer, that's a true piece of research, okay? That's what reflects what research is all about. It's about saying something's going on here, something is happening. I don't know what that something is, but I'm going to investigate it. I'm going to try and make sense of it. I'm going to try and use the information that I've captured to try and explain what is happening. Research requires courage. So as I've said already, it's a scary process. It can be long and it can be daunting, but once you get on that ladder, once you take that first step, you're then motivated by reaching the next milestone. You have targets along the way. You don't just think about it from day one that, here's my output. From day one, your focus is very much on trying to get to that research question stage, trying to understand the existing literature, trying to put together your understanding. Then you move on perhaps a couple of weeks later into trying to put together how you're going to investigate your research question, what methods you're going to use. Perhaps you design your interview questionnaire, perhaps you design your survey, perhaps you set up an experiment. Again, that takes time. You then have to gather the information, so you collect it. So again, it's a number of different milestones, okay? Research isn't just about jumping to the report or the outcome. Research is about going through those different steps and then putting everything together to produce your final answer. Research is characterized by patient and unhurried activity. So again, that hopefully kind of explains what I've been trying to say to you. It's a number of milestones. It's not a race. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon, okay? You're not here to get to the finishing line the fastest. You're here to overcome the hurdles and get to the finishing line with everything in place. Finally, research is carefully recorded and reported. So again, I've said this to you already. Good, solid, quality, trustworthy, and reliable research will be well recorded and it'll be well reported, okay? It's something that's got a paper trail, something that if I was to approach you and ask you, how did you get this answer? You should be able to say to me, well, here's what I did. Here's the evidence, here's the interviews, here's the surveys I carried out, here's the experiment, here's what the outcome of the experiment was, here is how that was understood by me, here's the evidence to show how I coded it and how I got to the final answer, okay? So these are all things that you should be able to demonstrate to defend your research. So there's a few different methods to how we approach research, but scientific method is what's used predominantly in the academic world. So what do you mean by scientific? Well, basically science refers to the body of systematic and organized knowledge, which makes the use of a scientific method in a particular field of inquiry. So again, what do you mean by science and scientific method? Well, basically it's something that's grounded in a scientific approach. Scientific in the sense that, no, you're not doing experiments all the time, but scientific in the sense that it's not about opinions, it's not about gossip, it's not about what we think is going on. It's actually based on cold, hard ways in which we can actually test something. So it's very scientific, it's rigorous. It's not just me sitting here writing a story, it's me investigating something using set methods, using a set structure, a set methodology that then proves or disproves what I'm trying to find. Scientific method is a systematic collection of data. So these are what's called facts, and their theoretical treatment through proper observation, experimentation, and interpretation. So what do you mean by that? Well, what did you take away from that? When you get that data set, how you understand and interpret that data set, it's very unique to you. I might interpret that slightly differently to how you've interpreted it. Who's to say you're right, I'm wrong, or I'm right and you're wrong? So what you need to then do is you have to be able to explain why you interpreted something the way you did. So someone said X, Y, and Z. How did that equal A, B, C in your outcomes? Okay, how did you interpret what that person was saying to produce a certain outcome, a certain result? So that's what it's all about, scientific inquiry. It's a method that attempts to achieve a systematic interrelation of facts by carrying out experiments, by carrying out observations, and through logical arguments from accepted postulates and a combination of those three in varying proportions. So again, you might want to do a little bit of experimentation, you might want to have some observations, you might also want some logic that's done through cold hard fact checking. So again, can you check company accounts to prove something happened the way the manager or the director told you it happened? Can you check government records to see if, you know, what people are saying about the economy is true? You know, what are the figures? What can we check that's readily available, that's already been measured? So again, scientific method or inquiry is all about validating what we're doing. It's about trying to find evidence. It's about trying to show that it's not just your understanding or your interpretation, it's actually your testing of that data as well as you making sure that data is robust. So some of the basic postulates in scientific method. Well, firstly, it relies on empirical evidence. So what's empirical evidence? Empirical evidence is data or information that's gathered directly for the purposes of a study. So empirical is where you actually go out there and you investigate something, you speak to people, you actually do some field research. Okay, it doesn't always have to be primary, it might be secondary, you might be looking at company reports, you might be looking at online websites and articles to try and see how something's been understood. You might want to look at social media, perhaps Twitter, you know, these things where things are posted. So again, it might not be you actually going out there and getting primary data. You might use what's called secondary data, but the idea is you're actually carrying out a study that involves real people, real objects, real businesses, real anything. You know, it's all about going out there and carrying out the investigation. So that's what we mean by empirical evidence. It utilizes relevant concepts. So again, if you're investigating, for example, strategy, I would expect to see you looking at things like competitive advantage, looking at things like how businesses compete, how businesses do decision making. These are all things that are relevant, okay? If you were to then start telling me something about how the business sells a product or how the business dealt with an employee situation, that's not necessarily a strategic thing, okay? That's something that perhaps is dealt with HR. It's an everyday thing done in the workplace. Boom, dealt with. It's not relevant to what you're looking at. So the concepts and what you're investigating should be relevant. If you're looking at one thing, but you're telling me something else, then it's not relevant. Again, it's about ensuring consistency, okay? So your concept should be relevant to what you're exploring. If you're exploring a particular topic in an area, the things you're looking at should be relevant to that topic and area. It is committed to only objective considerations. So again, as I said already, yes, the person you're interviewing, yes, the person that's filled out a survey may have given you a subjective opinion. They may have told you something that they think. It might not be, you know, a cold hard fact. It might not be something that reflects the reality of the situation. However, as far as you are concerned as a researcher, your job is to report that in an objective way, okay? You have to take that information and you have to present it as it was said. You can't twist the facts. Even if you think, or even if you can prove that you believe they're lying, you might want to discard it if you think it's not relevant. If you think someone's lied to you and, you know, they've not given you an accurate picture, you might want to discard their interview. You might not use their interview for your research, but certainly you don't want to be changing the facts, okay? That's not your role to do that. As a researcher, your job is to remain objective to all the considerations. That person may have their reasons for saying what they said, and your job as a researcher is to try and understand how their input combined with everyone else that you interview, everyone else that you experiment, contributes to our understanding of whatever it is you're investigating, okay? So it's about being objective. You are not there to judge what is right or wrong. You are there to report everything as it's captured, as it's explained, as it's analysed. It presupposes ethical neutrality. Now, that's an interesting one, and that's something that is still debated even today in research, okay? So it's almost like an assumption. We presuppose that as a researcher, we are ethically neutral, but that can be difficult to do. Sorry, someone got a question?
What's up?
What was that, sorry? Hello, can you say that again, please? Sorry, someone just asked a question and I couldn't understand. The line was breaking up. Can you ask the question again, please? No? Okay, well, if you do have the question, please share it in the chat. I wasn't able to hear what you were saying. Apologies. Yeah, so ethical neutrality. With research, researchers are said to be completely neutral. Now, that might sound easy to do on paper, but in reality, it can be very, very difficult, okay? Our job as a researcher is to report what we are understanding in an objective way, okay? We're not there to pass judgment. We're not there to add in our own opinions. We're just there to report what we've understood and present it so that we can understand further how it can be used going forward. Now, when it's simple things like, for example, understanding the strategy of a company or understanding how a particular species behaves when it comes across another species, something like that, that can be relatively okay. But what if you're investigating things that are very difficult? For example, what if you're investigating things around sexual exploitation? What if you're investigating things like child trafficking? What if you're investigating things such as prostitution? Maybe you're looking at things to do with same-sex marriage in particular countries in the world. So again, there's lots of different areas that perhaps are very, what's the word I'm looking for? Are very volatile from an ethically neutral perspective. You know, we all probably have our own feelings and opinions. It can be difficult to separate them. So whilst it's assumed that we're ethically neutral as researchers, there is an argument that how neutral can we be, okay? You know, if we don't agree with something, if we feel something is abhorrently wrong, as a researcher, are we really able to provide an objective account, or will we somehow still manage to try and present it in a negative slant? So these are the sorts of things that, you know, we assume is there in research, but it can be difficult to achieve, okay? It results into probabilistic predictions. So what does that mean? So when you've done your research and you've presented your outcome, your results of your study, very rarely will your results be 100% applicable across the different situations that might occur. Why? Because what you've done is an interpretation of what happened. That might have been just a one-off, that situation that you measured or you interviewed or you saw. It might have been that that situation was a result of bad practices used in the past. So things that may be changed. So what you've done is a probabilistic prediction. It's to say that based on what happened, the probability of this happening again is somewhat likely, okay? It may well happen. It might not be exactly the same, but it will be along the similar lines. So that's what I mean by probabilistic. We can't guarantee as researchers that what we're showing is going to happen each and every time. What we are saying is we can give you a way in which you can understand what's happened so that if it does happen again, it will likely happen similarly, okay? Finally, the methodology needs to be made known. So as I've said already, it's all about being transparent. It's about providing the paper trail, it's about providing evidence to what you're doing. You need to make it clear to whoever is marking your work, to whoever you're presenting the report to. If you're doing a report for people at work around research, if your manager asks you to research a market, you need to prove to your manager how you did that. What's the methodology that you adopted? It aims at formulating scientific theories. Now, scientific theories, this is more around academic research. So again, if we're doing research in an academic institution, we are looking at ways in which we can improve our theories. We can look at ways in which we improve our understanding of what's happening. So the fundamental premise of academic research might not always be to provide recommendations to managers or how things can be done better in the real world. It might be more to understand how can research better understand what's going on, how can we improve our theoretical knowledge or theoretical understandings of how the world works. So some of the criteria of a good research project. Well, the purpose of your project needs to be clearly defined. What does that mean? Well, if you're setting off to do a piece of research, you need to make it clear early on what the purpose of that research is, because that's going to be your guiding principle, okay? You don't know what the answer is going to be because you don't know that until you get to the end, until you started analysing all the information you captured. So at the very beginning, only thing that you know is what you're going to do. So what's the purpose of this? Okay, what am I going to do? Why am I doing this study? And that's your guiding purpose. You will also have a research process that's detailed. Again, I've explained why, so I'm not going to do that again, but really it's about making sure that you can demonstrate that you've got a design to your research approach. And that design is thoroughly planned, okay? It's not just made up on the spot. It's something that you've actually sat down, thought about, you've read into, you've understood how the different methodologies work, and you've applied it into practice. Okay, you've not just come up with something on the spot, you've done it on the day because it made sense. And finally, you've tried to adopt highly ethical standards. So again, as I said, this is something that's debated. It's probably subjective as to how much ethical standards you can get, but certainly the intention of all researchers is to ensure high ethical standards, is to ensure that we're not putting other people in harm's way, as well as not harming ourselves in our research, okay? We need to be careful. If we're reporting on what people are doing, if we're reporting on people's lives, we're reporting on things that mean a lot to people, we need to make sure we're safeguarding them. We're not putting them at risk by reporting on their lives. So again, from an ethical perspective, we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing by both the people that we've researched, but also the people for whom we're carrying out the research. The limitations are frankly revealed. So this is an important part of research. This is something that I often see researchers, particularly early stage researchers, ones that don't have much experience, they try and hide the limitations. They try and hide the weaknesses of your research. Now, I'll be honest, you can get the cleverest person in the world. You can have someone that's done 5 PhDs. You can have someone that's a professor in, the highest ranking business school or highest ranking university in the world. He or she will have limitations to their study. How do I know that? Because they present them in their papers, okay? All researchers at the end of their research study, at the end of their paper, at the end of their conference, journal, whatever it is they've written, they will present a section on limitations. In that section, they will acknowledge what the weaknesses of their study is. They will acknowledge that there were certain things that perhaps didn't go to plan, certain things that maybe would have been better if they'd done a different way. So again, any good researcher will have limitations. So if you present a research to me and you claim there's no limitations, it either means you haven't actually understood what you're doing properly, or you've just officially established yourself as the cleverest person in this universe, because to date, no one has done a study that doesn't have any limitations, okay? Adequate analysis for decision makers' needs. Again, when you're doing your data analysis, and you're trying to understand what information you've captured, you want to be able to give good analytical output for people, whether it's your manager, if you've done a report for work, whether it's for industry or for policymakers, if you're doing a report for the government, whether it's for academia, if you're doing a thesis or a dissertation for research. You want to be able to make some useful recommendations, some useful analysis, some useful output that can be used either directly or indirectly for another purpose, okay? The idea behind your research is that it should spur further thinking, it should spur further investigation, maybe it should spur further action. It might even lead to perhaps business changing the strategy, you don't know. The idea is you're trying to give them something to go on, okay? Not what you think they want to hear, but what you've observed, what you've understood from the data. That's something else that can be quite difficult as well. Perhaps your manager wants a report that shows what he or she is trying to do is correct, but the data doesn't prove that. The data says the opposite, perhaps. So again, it's your job to make sure you present that accurately. And that's not to say you call your manager a liar, but you certainly try and present the findings to your manager to say, you know, you believe this, however, the data shows this is what's happening. You know, it's about being transparent and honest to demonstrate how you got to that output. Your findings need to be presented unambiguously. So again, your findings can't be on the fence. Your findings need to be either yes or no. Your findings need to be black or white. You can't really say that my findings suggest that we could do this or we could also do that. That's not going to add value to anyone. You need to be unambiguous. You need to be able to demonstrate, if you're choosing between two options, which option is best and why, which option would relieve more benefits, which option, blah, 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 so on and so forth. You need to be unambiguous. You can't just sit on the fence with your output. And your conclusions have to be justified. So again, when you're concluding your research, you're trying to pull everything together in a succinct and coherent manner so that someone who's reading, say, I have to take your report, the first thing I would do is I would probably read the abstract. So the full kind of synopsis of what your study is. And then what I would do is I would skip all the way to the very end and I'd read your conclusion. I would read what it is that you've actually done. What is the key recommendation you've made? What is the fundamental purpose of you having done this report? So your conclusion has to be justified. It has to be an answer to everything that you've just done. And finally, the researcher's experience is reflected. Again, if you were to read a doctoral thesis done by any PhD candidate, you will see that he or she reflects on the learning experience. He or she reflects on the journey that they've taken. Now, I'm not saying that you have to do the same, but it's useful sometimes to reflect on what you did, how you did it, and perhaps even what you would do differently, okay? If you did a case study, why would you perhaps not do case study again? Maybe if you would now consider doing interviews, you would now consider doing surveys, experiments, so on and so forth, okay? So it's good to reflect on what you did and how you'd maybe change it going forward. What are some of the qualities of good research? Well, as you said already, systematic. It needs to be logical. You want to have some empirical basis, some real investigation of something happening in the real world. You want it to be replicable. So what does that mean? It means someone can repeat it. Because you've made it so clear, so transparent, you've documented your research process, I should be able to pick up your research project and implement it myself, and I should theoretically or on paper get similar results. Yes, I might not get the same results because the world changes, people change, you know, technology advances, things might be done differently, but I should get a similar output to what you've captured. If I'm getting the complete opposite by doing the exact same thing you did, then there's something wrong. Creative, it needs to be something that, you know, is new and unique. In research, we're not looking to repeat what's already been done. We're looking to try and add something new. So it needs to be creative. It needs to be, you know, done in a way that it's adding value. It should show some demonstration of multiple methods. So again, if you've done just case study or just interview or just observations, then it's probably not enough, because that's just one way in which you can understand something. A combination of these methods or a combination of these approaches shows triangulation. So triangulation is where you have ideally 3 or more data points that converge, that bring your evidence together. So it's not just about saying, I saw this from interviews or I saw this from my observations. It's about saying, here's what's from my observations, here's what's captured in the survey, and here's what was documented in the company reports. Looking at 3 of these bits of information together, we can see that this holds true, okay? So you want to be able to prove or disprove something by verifying it, by checking it, by triangulating your data. So you might be thinking, research is quite heavy going. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different steps I need to be aware of. Why should I do it? What's the need for this research? Well, firstly, it's about exploring something. If we don't know what's going on in the world, if we don't know what impact something is having, then we're not really able to properly prepare for it. We're not really able to take action. Managers and businesses won't be able to make decisions that allow the business to grow, that allow the business to overcome situations. So you need to explore, you need to be able to understand that, you know, the world's changing, things are constantly going on, evolving. We need to explore what's going on. We need to be able to explain what's going on in the world. We need to be able to describe. So it's not just about explaining or exploring, it's about describing it. It's about understanding the impact it's having on certain groups, certain regions, certain species, whatever it is. So if you're in climate change research, you might be looking at, you know, describing the impact of global warming on perhaps, you know, a particular species of animal, on perhaps a particular continent, or perhaps, you know, a particular area geographically in the world. So it's all about understanding the impacts, about understanding the influence of something on another. You might diagnose, so diagnostic analysis, all about trying to understand the knock-on repercussions. Hypothesis, so again, testing something. You believe two things are related or two things have an impact on one another. How are you going to test that? How are you going to prove or disprove what you think is true? And then we have what's called induction and deduction. Now, I'll explain this in more detail later on as well, but induction is basically where you start from nothing and you build up, okay? So inductive research tends to be something is happening, I don't know what it is, I am going to go out there, I'm going to investigate, and I'm going to try and make sense of it. That's what you call inductive research, okay? We don't really know what's happening. We don't really want to spend much time researching books, journals, etc. We want to just go out there and capture the information, capture what's going on, and then try and make sense of it, and then read the books, and then read other areas so that we can make sense of what's going on. That's induction, starting blind, basically. But deduction is slightly different. Now, deduction is where you actually start with either a hypothesis, so you want to prove or disprove something, or you start by perhaps looking at the literature. So, someone got a question, sorry? Sorry, can I just make sure everyone ensures that they're in mute, please? It's not very fair on everyone else when you start talking to either your friends or your family or whoever it is in the background and people are trying to learn, okay? So please make sure you're on mute. So deduction, as I said already, you could start with a hypothesis, try to prove or disprove, so you're breaking it down. Or alternatively, you could start by reading the research that's already done in that area. So say you want to look at global warming and the impact on polar bears, for example. Well, you may have to look at research that's already been done on climate change. Well, maybe want to look at research that's been done on the evolution of the polar bear species. So again, you would look at existing research to try and formulate a research problem, a research issue, a research area that you want to investigate. Then you break it down that way, okay? So deductive, it's about starting from a basis, it's about having some foundation to go on. Whereas inductive, it's about saying, I'm going in blind, I've got a research question, but I want to gather the information first before I try and make sense of it. What about the scope or significance of research? So why do we do research? Well, basically, we want to be able to inform our decision making. We want to make sure that any decisions we're making in an organization are done on the basis of scientific research. Okay, we've got evidence to support our decision. Any boardroom, any senior director, any senior manager won't take a decision on what they're doing until they've seen the evidence. They want proof that what they're doing is going to help the organization, is going to make a difference. So research is important for decision making. It also throws light on risks and uncertainty. So it identifies areas where things maybe aren't going to plan, things where we need to be aware of issues, things where perhaps there's uncertainty, there's things that need better explanation. So again, research can do that. Research can help identify alternative courses of action. So again, by carrying out research, we might identify better ways of doing things. We might identify ways in which things can be approached, ways in which things can be done that haven't yet been adopted or haven't yet been tried and tested in existing approaches. It can also help in economic use of resources. So again, it might help inform how resources are used and managed. It might actually make it better, you know. We might be able to find ways in which we can perhaps save our natural resources. We might be able to find ways in which resources can be made more efficient. So again, research can allow us to do that. And finally, it helps in project identification. So again, by carrying out research, we can then perhaps say, okay, this project is better for us to pursue because it allows us to gain better understanding of something, allows us to achieve a better result, it allows us to make more money, so on and so forth, whatever the case may be. Okay, so there's lots of different ways in which the scope and the significance of research impacts on what we're doing. Some more things, perhaps more organization approach. So again, perhaps you're in a business and the head of finance has asked you to do a little bit of research into which project they should be trying to invest money into. So again, you might want to research different approaches, different projects, how they've been used, how they've been employed in other areas, how have other businesses approached what problem your company is facing. This is a research you can carry out. Solve pricing problems, solve allocation problems. HR can use it if you're working in a human resources function. You might want to make certain decisions about how employees behave, change management programs, different technology programs, etc., etc. Operational problems, planning. I'm sure you get the point now. The idea is research can be used in a whole host of different ways, but for us in the business world or in the business context, we can use it in these areas as well. Let's take a quick break. I am wary of the fact I've been talking for 1 hour, and I think my voice needs a break, and I'm sure you all need a break from hearing my voice too. So let's reconvene in 5 minutes. So 5-minute break, and we will continue looking at what the uses of research are before we go into structuring how we would approach our own research. Okay, so 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene shortly. Thank you. Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hopefully you all had a chance to stretch your legs, grab a tea or a coffee. Let's resume then with where we were at. So trying to understand the scope and significance of research. So just again, other areas in which it can be used: help the government, help social scientists, help professionals, in both research and practice. It can help students. And further use for philosophy and gaining further insights into how we work as human beings. For literary men and women, you know, everyday people can use new styles. They can use new prospects, new processes, new ways of working. Okay, new things that can be done. And again, for analysts, intellectuals, researchers, etc., what we do in research can be used by other researchers going forward. So again, it's about making sure we're providing that robustness so other people can use the approach going forward. But what are some of the problems in research? Well, firstly, it's not actually that similar to science, because in science, you're actually carrying out real life experiments. You know, you're perhaps looking at medicines, you're perhaps looking at chemicals, you're physically experimenting. How can you compare that to what we call experiments in social science research or, in business research? We're not actually doing what scientists do. We're not actually checking something for cold, hard, yes and no facts. Our stuff can be subjective based on what people are telling us. We're dealing with words, we're dealing with numbers. We're not actually dealing with physical human beings or physical, we're not dealing with, when it comes to products, chemicals, we're not actually applying things directly ourselves. We're actually looking at other people's perceptions, other people's takes, other people's explanations of how things are done. So perhaps we're not that similar to science as we would lead ourselves to believe. Secondly, what about the control of the variables? If you're doing an experiment, the idea is you have what's called a control group and an experiment group, but how much control do you really have over your variables? I mean, things can change. For example, imagine starting a research project at the start of March 2020, before coronavirus hit the Western world. Once you got to the end of March, you're only halfway through your research. All of a sudden, the whole world shuts down. Every country goes into lockdown. You're now no longer able to test certain things. You're now no longer to have control. You can't come in close contact with people. So all of a sudden, you can't control your variables. So again, in research, that's a problem we can have. That's an extreme situation because obviously coronavirus and the pandemic doesn't happen every year, but other things can happen. You know, people might unfortunately pass away. You know, sometimes you do an experiment group, you do a 5-year study, you're looking at, you know, how health implications affect certain groups, perhaps old age population you're looking at. All of a sudden, a year later, one of the members of your control group dies or another member of your experiment group dies. So again, you lose control over those factors, okay? The variables can change and they're out with your control. You can't keep them consistent. So that can be an issue as well. Human tendencies. So again, we're human beings. Now, as human beings, we are very subjective with what we show and who we show it to, okay? The way in which we behave with our personal relatives, our close family, our community, you know, our partners maybe, is very, very different to how we perhaps behave in the real world. We're maybe more closed off, we don't share the same amount of information. In the workplace, you're probably more professional, whereas outside you're more sociable, you're more, you know, you're more willing to share a lot more of your personality. So again, human tendencies will influence that. If you're a researcher looking at that, maybe you're doing a research of me in the workplace. Me in the workplace is a very different person to me in my social life. So if you're drawing conclusions based on how I behave in the workplace, that might not actually be my real behavior. That might be an adopted behavior, or behavior that I'm purposely demonstrating because I want to make sure that I'm seen to do the right thing at work. So again, human tendencies, we are very subjective people. How we behave isn't consistent all the time. Time and money, again, depending on how much money you have to invest in your research project, depending on how long you have to do your research project, that will have an impact on the output. If you've got unlimited resources and you've got unlimited time, you can do it as long as you want to do the project. Well, then realistically, you have more access. You'll be able to spend more money trying to gain access. You'll be able to talk to more people. You don't have any time constraints, or limits on your study. But similarly, in reality, every organization has constraints. They can't give you unlimited time. They might give you 6 months. They might give you 2 months. They might give you £10,000, or they might give you £100,000. They all have their budgets. They all have their constraints. No one is going to let you have unlimited money, unlimited time to do your research. And obviously, you have to then focus your research based on time that you have on a particular area. Lack of computerization. Now, again, technology is developing at a very, very rapid pace. And in research, unfortunately, we're not really catching up in the same way that we would expect. Now, you would think that, you know, perhaps given the nature of the world, yes, there are certain technologies that can help us as researchers, but there's others that are still out there that we could be using that we're not. For example, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence can capture human behavior, or a way in which a human evolves, or a human behaves, or a human reacts much better than I can as a human being. If I'm observing something, my observations will be very, very different compared to what an AI platform, for example, can capture. Unfortunately, that costs a lot of money. Hiring me as a researcher is a relatively cheaper alternative. Okay, so computerization had an impact. Now, this is something that's impacting a lot of the community around training. Now, if you haven't had scientific training, if you don't actually know research processes, research methods, ways to approach research, then you're not necessarily well equipped to carry out research. Now, in organizations, perhaps businesses don't have that same level of attention to these sorts of things because they don't really care about the research process as much. They just want to get it done and see if what they've done is reflected well in the reports. However, if you've got someone who doesn't know these things carrying out the research, that person might be biased. They might do a report which doesn't actually truly reflect what's going on. They might find that, you know, this investment project is perfect, but if they were to do it properly, if they do structured research, they would actually get an answer that maybe shows it's not reliable. Maybe it would cost them so much money that they would actually lose everything. So again, businesses don't tend to prioritize the scientific part, but we're telling you this because it's important, okay? Because if you are doing research, you want to ensure that your approach is robust. You want to ensure that your approach is one that allows for repetition is what I wanted to say, or replicability, and also something that's robust, okay? Something that can be done again and again, something that's highly rigorous and something that's very transparent. What are some of the issues we have in education? Well, in education, unfortunately, research departments don't tend to talk to one another, and we certainly don't tend to talk with business establishments. What you tend to find is businesses sometimes are researching exactly what scientific departments and universities are doing. For example, I was working on a project on my PhD thesis, and the area I was looking at was broadly similar to an area that one of the large financial institutions were looking at. Goldman Sachs had an analyst trying to investigate pretty much identical area that I was. Now, perhaps had Goldman Sachs approached my university, they could have perhaps hired some of my stuff, they could have paid for some of my research, and my research could have been provided to them. Instead, they've got someone doing the exact same thing that I'm doing, albeit for them rather than for the university I did it for. So again, that's an example of replication. That's an example of the universities not talking to businesses or businesses not talking to universities. We can share information. We can actually make things done better, perhaps by working together. With Goldman Sachs, I could have done a better PhD thesis. That analyst could have got more informed inroads into the area he was exploring. So again, it's all about making sure that we're talking to one another. Lack of confidence in part of the business units to give information. Again, businesses are notoriously conservative. They don't want to share information. If they've done research, that's cost them money. They've paid good money for that research. They don't want to share that with anyone else. They want to keep that in-house. Why should they share that? They paid money for it. It's not free. So again, that's a problem. There can be a lack of code of conduct. And this, unfortunately, is very true of research carried out by industry. Not all industries. Some industries are very good. They have really robust processes. But unfortunately, you sometimes come across research carried out by industry practitioners or carried out by some of these industry companies, and there really is no direct code of conduct. They just do what they have to do to get there. There's no ethics, there's no real morality around what they're doing. They're just doing it because they've been told that's what they're getting paid for. They want to earn a wage to go and do it. So that's something to be wary of, code of conduct, and how reliable that research is. Was that research done truthfully? Was it perhaps done by bribing someone? Was it perhaps done by paying people to say a certain thing? Again, I'm not accusing anyone of doing that, but what I'm saying is code of conduct doesn't tend to exist in industry publications. Sometimes they will just do what they have to do to try and prove or disprove a particular decision. So again, the morality of it, the ethical stuff is quite pertinent when it comes to industry research. And finally, the difficulty of adequate and timely secretarial assistance. Again, depending on the size of your project, you might need other people to support you. The availability of those people, skilled people, can be difficult. This again, other areas. I'm not going to go through each of them individually. They're there in front of you just to give you an idea of some of the issues you might face when doing research. Finally, we're going to look at research and decision making. Well, decision making is a process of selecting the best alternatives. Okay, so it's about saying, here's the options, what do we choose? And management is chiefly concerned with decision making and its implementation. Okay, so if you're in management role, you're all about, okay, how does this decision get implemented? How do we take that strategic option? How do we take that strategy that the business has adopted and turn that into an everyday plan? So these decisions should be based on appropriate studies, evaluations, and observations. So if business is using our research, they should make sure that they've identified the liabilities, they've identified the limitations of our study, they've actually understood what we've done, they've understood the impact of what we've done, and then they've used it on the basis of how it affects their own decision making. The research provides us with knowledge and skills needed to solve the problems and to meet the challenges of a fast-paced business decision-making environment. So again, research gives us knowledge and skills. It gives us an opportunity to understand something better. I'm not saying that better always is correct. Sometimes that better can can shed a different light. Sometimes it can confuse people, but that's not good. You don't want it to do that, but it can do that. It could be that something that we've always held to be true for the last 20 years, 30 years, all of a sudden is proven to be distrue or proven to be false. Then we have a problem here, because everything everyone's been doing for the last 20 years has been based on potentially a lie. So again, it can confuse people. We need to make sure that our research is robust, so that if someone checks it, they can say, okay, this is correct. Yep, this is right. We need to be able to follow this accurately. Okay. According to Herbert Simon, there are a few things that are involved in decision making. Number one, intelligence activity. What does that mean? Well, that's when you scan the environment and identify the conditions that are necessary for a decision. You then design the activity, and you then choose the activity, so activity choice. That's very identical with what happens in research. We do scanning the environment. Our scanning of the environment is our literature review. We review the literature that's already out there. We try and understand what people are saying about our field, how people feel about what we're doing. We then design our research project. We look at interview design, we look at case study design, we look at experimentation, we look at surveys, we look at hypothesis testing, all these different things. And we then choose which one we're going to do, which one's going to add the most value. Now, there are factors that can affect managerial decisions. These can be internal factors. No matter how good the report is that's being produced by you, your manager may have pressure on him or her to choose an option because the senior director says it needs to be done, or the shareholder pressure. So again, our reports, as good as they are, they might still not be adopted. Number of organizations that have actually carried out reports that have actually shown decisions that they've made 20 years ago would have been better informed had they followed the steps in the report, but it didn't do it. Why did it not do it? Because there's pressure from perhaps senior managers to say, no, this is not an attractive option, or perhaps shareholders didn't want the company to do that. They were revolting. So again, our research is a small part of a bigger picture and something we need to be aware of. There can also be external factors, legal frameworks. They can be, so again, we might identify something that if adopted could save the business 100% of their costs, but perhaps there's legal frameworks in place in that country that stop them from doing that. Perhaps there's geographical constraints, perhaps there's cultural constraints, and based on where they operate, that perhaps they can't adopt a certain practice. So again, these are things that happen outside of our research. We can't always plan for them, we can't always predict them. All we can do is make aware that there are limitations. Our study is based on these assumptions. These assumptions may or may not hold true in your own context. Other factors include qualitative and quantitative. So again, the nature of our research, is it based on numbers? Is it based on observations and descriptions? And finally, uncertainty factors. What are those? Those are like basically contingency factors, those things that cannot be predicted. So again, COVID could not have been predicted. If you as a business paid a researcher to research, a couple of projects that you wanted to invest in at the end of 2019, well, they might have done some research based on the information that's available at the end of 2019. They might not have understood COVID to be such a big concern. However, come March 2020, when the whole world shut down, it became a massive concern. So again, that was an uncertainty factor. No one knew what was going to happen. That was contingency. There's no way anyone could have predicted the grand scale impact it would have. So again, we've talked about types of research before as well, but the two key ones are what we call descriptive and analytical. So descriptive is all about fact finding. It's all about describing what's going on. It's all about saying, this is what's happened. Here's what's been understood. Here's a description of what's going on. Okay. It's about explaining something. It's about giving something a voice. Analytical research, however, on the other hand, is all about analyzing. It's about testing hypotheses. It's about specifying and interpreting some of the relationships between variables. It's about analysing facts and information that have been made available. So analysis is about understanding, it's about decoding, it's about trying to get beneath the data, whereas description is simply describing what's happening. It's almost more like a storytelling approach compared to analysis. So you've got descriptive research or you've got analytical research. We also have a distinction between what we call applied and fundamental research. So applied research, sometimes also known as action research, is carried out to find a solution to a real life problem that requires something to be done, or requires a policy decision, or requires the government to be involved. So applied research is what you tend to see government bodies doing. It's what you tend to see some of the think tanks, some of these organizations employed by the government. They do what's called applied research. They're trying to find problems to real life issues affecting perhaps the government, affecting socioeconomic conditions. So this is all think tank activity. But we also have what's called fundamental research. Now, fundamental research is basic or pure research in the context that it's taken for the sake of progressing knowledge. We're doing this research because we want to improve our understanding of how the world works, of how certain things work. It's usually undertaken out of what we call intellectual curiosity, rather than by taking into consideration a specific problem. So again, what you tend to find is if you decide to do a PhD at university, you will do what's called fundamental research. I mean, what you're doing is good, but it's not a pressing concern. It's not something that's affecting, you know, the role of what government's doing exactly today. The government might have a passive role. They might care about what you're doing from a passive perspective, but it's not an active role they have in your project. You're doing a fundamental research. You're doing something that develops an understanding of how that concept works. You're not necessarily doing anything that's going to impact directly into, for example, policy. A byproduct of your research may well be it impacts policy, but that's not the fundamental purpose with why you've gone out to do it. Okay. Finally, we've got quantitative and qualitative. Now, we spoke about this earlier on as well, but quantitative is basically employed for measuring. So you can look at measuring the quantity of something, the amount of something, and it's usually something that's done through what we call statistical analysis. So you're doing numbers, you're crunching numbers, you're looking at averages, you're looking at means, you're looking at R numbers, you're looking at square roots. These are the sorts of things you're dealing with. Why are you doing that? We're trying to find the relationship via maths, okay? So you're using numbers to prove or disprove. Qualitative research, it's kind of the opposite. So with qualitative, you're doing non-quantitative. So you're looking at stuff like interviews, case studies, you're looking at observations, you're looking at field notes to try and understand a phenomena in practice. You're basing it on what you're seeing, you're basing it on what you're hearing. There's no real cold, hard evidence. It's very subjective. It's about people's lived experiences, about people talking about what they did, how they did it, why they did it. Okay. What about conceptual versus empirical? Well, conceptual research is basically that which is done for philosophers. It's done for people that are thinking about knowledge. So again, if you're trying to do research or research about knowledge, or research about how we improve our way of doing research, then that's very conceptual, because you're basing it on theoretical models, you're basing it on ways in which existing theories work or don't work. So that's called a conceptual research. However, vast majority of research that we do, both in industry and in research as well nowadays, is what's called empirical research. It's all about data-based research, which depends on the experiences or the observations alone. Is aimed at coming up with what we call the conclusions or outcomes, which are done with regards to both the system and the theory. So you want to improve things, you want to improve processes, you want to improve ways of working, as well as make a contribution to theory, okay? And that's what's called empirical research. So that's what we define as scientific. Scientific is empirical. It's about finding better ways of doing things. It's about improving our understanding. It's about proving or disproving how something may or may not work better. There are other types of research. These are also out there and do exist, but they're not as common perhaps as empirical or conceptual. You have what's called a one-time research. Now that tends to be confined to a single time period. What do you mean by that? Well, that's done on a particular era, done on a particular area, done on a particular event. For example, if you were to look at the impact of COVID and the Tokyo Olympics together, well, that's realistically going to be a one-time event. The likelihood of COVID happening or coronavirus happening again at the same time as the Tokyo Olympics also being on together is very, very unlikely, okay? So if your study is based on the impact of coronavirus at the Tokyo Olympics and what it meant for the Japanese consumer, then that's a very specific study. It's very one-off. The likelihood of that situation occurring in 10, 20, 100, 200, how many ever 1,000 years of time is very, very unlikely. So it's a one-time study. Longitudinal research, now this is something that's done over several time periods. So this tends to happen, for example, if you're trying to understand the impact of maybe the government policy. So you might look at when a new government comes in, what have they changed in the first 6 months? You might revisit it after 2 years to see what impact it's had. You might then come back up to 5 years towards the end of the government term when they're about to leave office to try and understand the impact of government policy. So it's done over time, okay? It's about seeing how something evolves over time. Similarly, if you're doing a study based on a company and a company strategy, so again, today a CEO might come into the job, he or she announces a new strategy in the first 30 days. You might want to do a longitudinal study to see how successful that strategy is going to be. So you might study today what they've implemented. You might revisit it in 6 months' time to see what early progress has been made in getting that strategy up and running. You might revisit in 1 or 2 years' time to see, okay, what's the results looking like? And you might look at it in 5 years' time to kind of look back and say, okay, how's that impacted the performance of the company over a 5-year period? So again, that's what we call a longitudinal study. You're looking at the impact of a decision, impact of what was done over a longer period of time or several time periods. Diagnostic research, we talked about this already, but this tends to be what's called clinical research. Okay, it's all about trying to identify root cause. It's about what's the cause of a problem, why does it occur, not why does it occur, but how often does it occur, and what might be a potential solution for it. And finally, exploratory research, we spoke about already, is basically trying to study the unknown, something unfamiliar, something we don't know, something that we have little knowledge of. And the idea of undertaking the study is to gain familiarity, is to generate new ideas, or is to make precise information of the problem. So it's also known as formulative or exploratory. Experimental research, again, the hint is in the name. Experimental research is all about trying to carry out an experiment to prove or disprove something, try and see what the impact is on a particular variable. You know, how does something react when faced with something else? So again, you set up an experiment. Perhaps you've got a control group and an experiment group. So for example, you've got 10 students. You set them into 2 groups, 5 in experiment group, 5 in the control group. Control group keep doing everything the way they were doing it. You know, they keep living their life as they were. They don't change their lifestyle. They like partying. They like staying up late, so on and so forth. You have an experiment group. You give them a very strict timetable. They have to be in bed by 9 p.m. They have to go to every single class. They're not allowed to, you know, play video games after so many hours on a day. They're not allowed to go to clubs during the weeks, only at weekends, so on and so forth. You might observe over a year of time how their learning evolves, which group's learning more, which group's got a better learning. Again, this is an example of an experiment you might carry out. Historical research, this is all about studying past records. This is all about existing information, existing reports, and finding ways to interpret those, okay? So in order to understand the present and to anticipate the future. So how does it all come together? So I've been talking a lot about the research process, and I've been trying to explain to you what the significance of research is and how research comes together. But here's a framework, okay? And this is quite a useful one for understanding what the different stages are of a research project. At the very beginning of a lecture, I said to you that research is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's all about the milestones, but here are some of the milestones that exist in a research. So what might happen? So part one, you might start off by saying, okay, I need to define my research problem. So as I said to you, you can't just come in and say, here's my research question, I'm going to go investigate it. You need to do some kind of background reading, usually you need to do some kind of investigation before you define or refine your research questions. So you start off by saying, okay, here's a rough area I want to explore, but I need to really define what I'm looking to do with it. So how would you do that? You would start off by reviewing the literature. You start off by seeing what information exists already about the area you're trying to explore. So here we're talking about things like existing concepts and theories. What are existing scholars saying about this area? Here we're looking at reviewing previous research findings. So what previous research has been carried out? What research is saying about your area? So again, it's about understanding what's already out there. Using that information, you would then either formulate your hypothesis or come up with your research questions that you're going to tackle. So that's what you do at stage 3, okay? Having tried to define your research problem, combine it with existing literature, existing academic arguments, existing academic viewpoints, and then you formulate your hypothesis or you formulate your research question. Once you've got your hypothesis or your research question, you would then design your research. You would look at things like interview designs, you look at things like case study, survey method, you could look at experiments, hypothesis testing, observations. These are all things that you might want to do as part of your research design. You then collect the data, so you go ahead and do that study as you've designed it. Once you've collected it, you would then analyze that data. So you start to interpret it, you start to make sense of it. What's it showing you? What's it saying to you? That information that you've gathered, what does it mean? So that can be an iterative process. Sometimes you have to go back and forward. You might have come to the end of your first phase of data collection, but what you find maybe doesn't quite, prove or disprove anything. Maybe you need to interview more people because your sample size is quite small and your findings are inconclusive. So again, you may have to go back and interview more people. Perhaps you made a mistake in the design, something needs to change. So again, it's iterative. You end up going back and forward quite a few times until you've got a satisfactory amount of data. Once you've analyzed the data, you then interpret it and you report it. Okay, that's when you start to turn it into some sort of significant output. This is when you start to provide policy recommendations. This is when you start to provide ideas or suggestions for future research. It's when you start to really make a difference with your research. Okay. So that is the research process diagram. Now there's multiple diagrams that exist and they're all very, very similar to this. Okay. It's all about showing you the different steps involved. This is a 7-step research process diagram. And it shows you where perhaps you have to go back and forward. So you've got feedback and feed forward. So information goes back and forward between these areas, and these are used to inform each other. So how do we define the research problem? So as you remember, step 1 I said was defining the research problem. How do we do it? Well, what do we mean by research problem? Firstly, the term problem basically means a question or an issue to be examined. Okay, so when we say what's a research problem, we basically mean, well, what is the research question? What is it that we want to examine? Now, the research problem refers to some difficulty or need which a researcher experiences in the context of either a theoretical or a practical situation, and he or she wants to obtain a solution for the same. So again, it's something that is seen maybe not as a problem per se, but it's seen as something that we don't know anything about or something that we have limited knowledge on. I want to improve that knowledge. Okay, it's about improving what we're doing. It's about improving our understanding, improving our knowledge or experience of a particular thing. Well, how do we know when we have a research problem? So you might be thinking, okay, but how do we recognize that we have a problem? Well, if you're working in an organization, maybe you get a number of customer complaints about a particular product, particular service, maybe even the way in which your organization works. So if you're getting complaints, then perhaps it's time for you to understand, well, what's going on? Let's do some research and try and understand what's happening in our company, what's happening in the production process, what's happening in customer service. Why is our business getting poor reviews? Perhaps it's through conversations with your company employees, particularly shop floor employees. Why? Because they're the ones that interact with the customers. They're the ones that hear firsthand from the customers what their pain points are, what their issues are. So again, you might want to have a conversation with your employees. You might want to observe any inappropriate behavior or conditions within the firm. So again, that might be you saying, okay, something's not quite right. I want to spend the next 2 months trying to see what's going on, understand what people are doing, understand their behaviors. So it's about observing, just watching them, seeing what they're doing, seeing how they're doing their job. So observations usually used as well. Deviation from the business plan. So again, you might look at the business plan and try to understand what have we done? Why is what we're doing different from what we plan to do? Where have we deviated? Again, research might be important for that. success of a firm's competitor. So maybe your competition is doing very, very well and your sales or your revenue growth is quite weak or is nowhere near the same level. So you want to understand what have they done that you haven't? Why are they so successful? Why are they realizing better returns? So again, you may want to do some research. Perhaps you've read something. So perhaps, there's these think tanks, these organizations, there's even industry companies now, like some McKinsey, BCG, they compute reports that talk about trends, talk about regulations changing, they talk about how the future of work is changing, future of manufacturing, the future of service orientation, technology, etc. You may have read something and thought, okay, that's really interesting, that could maybe improve my organization. Why don't I carry some research into how practical that thing may be? And finally, maybe just company records and reports. Maybe you're looking at your company records over a 5-year period and you realize that the trend is negative. You've got problems, things are going wrong for your organization. How are you going to improve? So the first step in any research process is the definition of the problem, okay? And that involves 2 activities. Number 1 is about identifying and selecting a problem. Once you've done that, you then have to formulate that problem. So again, it's not just about saying, here's a problem, that's me done, that's me about a research question. Not really. You've got a research area, you've got a general topic you want to investigate, but you then want to formulate a research question out of that, something that can be measured, something that can be tested, something that can be researched, okay? So for example, I might have a problem with how the government is performing at an economic level, or from an economic perspective, how the UK government is performing. Now that's not really a research problem, that's a research area, okay? Government policy, economics, UK, those are the rough areas I'm investigating. But what's my exact research problem? Maybe it's a specific one. Maybe I want to look at the role of the UK budgetary policy in impacting the UK's recovery from coronavirus pandemic. Now that's a research problem, okay, because I'm looking specifically at an area of government practice. I'm looking at budget policy. I'm looking at a specific recovery plan, which is the coronavirus pandemic recovery plan. So again, that's me being very, very specific. That's me formulating a research problem or a research issue. I'm no longer talking about a general area. I'm talking about a specific problem. So that's quite important in formulating your research question. So how do you identify and select the research problem? Well, this step involves identification of a few different problems, and then you select one which you think is the most interesting, one that you think is where you want to add value, or one that you think is where you have something to say or you have something to investigate. Where can these problems emerge from? Well, maybe from your readings. You might do some readings and find that there's issues with a particular process, issues with a particular way of working, issues with a particular way in which the world perceives a certain element. Maybe it's from academic experience. So again, perhaps you're in the research world yourself, you've got experience, you know how things work in the academic context, maybe they're different in practice. What's the problem? What's going on? Daily experiences. So if you work in a particular function or a particular area of a business, maybe you've observed things that are different to what's being reported. So again, that might be an area of where you pick up the problem. Exposure to field situations, very similar to daily experience. So again, maybe you're a consultant, you've gone out on a job for 6 months and all of a sudden you've identified ways that business is working and it's not quite right. So again, that might be an area from where the research problem emerges and you want to do some research. Consultations. So consultations are, perhaps where you're talking to one another, you're talking to different people in an organization, you're trying to capture, different perspectives. Maybe through a brainstorming exercise, maybe, a strategy workshop, strategy away day. You've got some managers in a room talking about, their plans for their department or their business. And again, you try to understand, okay, well, perhaps this is something that's relevant. Perhaps this is something. So again, you can pick out areas. You can pick out areas from existing research and you can perhaps use your intuition. But how do you select? Is there a criteria, who's to say that you've chosen right or not chosen right, as the case may be? So it requires some degree of what we call evaluation, okay? And there's 2 levels basically that we want to, or we are concerned with directly. The internal or the personal criteria level, that's quite important, okay? So researchers' interests, researchers' competence, researchers' own resources, finance, time, these are all internal constraints. These are things that can influence what you can and can't do. So, you might have a particular interest in blockchain technology. So you might want to do research into finance and blockchain. You might have an interest in artificial intelligence. Again, you might want to look at robotics. You might want to look. So again, your personal interests will sometimes shape what you can and can't do. Obviously, finance and time we spoke about already. External criteria also exists. So the researchability of the problem. Again, how much research can be done? How accessible is the information? So if we take, for example, Area 51 in the USA, now no one knows really where it is or what's done in that facility. I don't think anyone outside of senior US officials has access to Area 51. So you wouldn't be able to access that. So you couldn't research that area. You would get literally thrown in jail by the American government if you tried to break in, if you tried to get access without authorization. But you wouldn't get authorization as a researcher to go and research it anyway. So again, access, how researchable something is. The importance and urgency of what you want to do. I mean, if you're looking at perhaps the recovery of a country from COVID, then yes, maybe the government's willing to sponsor that, they're willing to give you money. But if you're looking at, I don't know, the future of robotics and how we might have flying cars, well, that's maybe not as important right now. No one really cares about flying cars. Right now, there's more pressing matters to worry ourselves with. So again, how important, how urgent your area is can have an impact on what you can and can't do. The feasibility we've talked about already, the facilities, again, so what's available to you, the usefulness and the social relevance. So again, how useful is your research going to be? And finally, research personnel. Do you have access to the people? Do you have access to the resources required to carry out the research that you want to do? So coming back to defining the formulation, defining or formulating a research problem. So formulation is a process of refining the research ideas into exact research questions and objectives. So if you remember, I gave you the example earlier, me saying I want to investigate the UK government and their role in economic policy from emerging from the pandemic. That's not a research question, okay? That's more of a research idea. I want to turn that into research questions and objectives. And how do I do that? Well, I start by translating and transforming the selected research problem, topic, or idea into what's called a scientifically researchable question. What's that? Well, that's something that's concerned with specifying exactly what the research problem is. So with my example of the UK government, of economic policy and coronavirus, then I might say, I want to investigate specifically how the UK government's budgetary policy, so again, a specific area of government practice, has impacted the recovery of the hospitality sector post-coronavirus pandemic. And that's very, very specific, okay? I'm looking at how the government's using their budgetary policy power to influence a particular industry sector of the economy, the hospitality sector, in the post-COVID pandemic world, okay? So that's a research question. That's very specific. I've broken it down. I've given it focus. However, if I was just to say I want to investigate the role of the UK government and their economic policy in the coronavirus pandemic, then that's not a research question, okay? It's too broad, it's too generic, it doesn't have a focus. So that's what we mean by formulating or defining a question. We need to take it, we should deconstruct it and turn it into a very specific area that we want to then investigate. Problem definition or problem statement is a clear, precise, and sufficient statement of the question or issue that is to be investigated with the goal of finding an answer or a solution. What do you mean by that? Well, there's two ways in which we can state a problem. We can either start by posting a question or a series of questions, or we can make what's called a declarative statement or statements. So if you're doing an investigation, you're looking at things like how or what or why. So again, you're trying to investigate something, you want to describe it, you want to explain it, you want to explore it, okay? So it's all about how, the what, the whys. These are all questions. Anything that starts with a how, a what, or a why is a question, basically. Or you could do what's called hypothesis testing. Now that's where you make a declarative statement, you make an assumption, you say something is happening because of something, and the purpose of your research is to then prove that or disprove it. So you might be saying that, I don't know, people that have access to the internet have better chances of progressing through education or have better educational attainment. So again, that's you making an assumption. You're saying through access to the internet, IT device, that student can have better education. That's an assumption. You would then go and test that assumption to prove whether or not it's true. Okay, so that's number two. That's you making a declarative statement or a number of statements about a particular topic or a particular area. So what's the process that's involved in defining the problem? Well, basically it's a statement of the problem in a general way. So how do you state that problem? Okay, you have to understand the nature of the problem firstly, and you then have to survey the available literature. You have to develop ideas through discussion, and you have to rephrase the research problem. So what do you do? Well, you have a general area that you've identified. You then try and understand that area. You do some digging around. You speak to people perhaps that work in that area. Maybe you speak to one of the government policy ministers. You understand what the government's doing. If you're looking at government, for example, you would then survey the literature. What have other scholars said? What have other researchers been saying about this topic? You then develop your ideas through discussion. So again, that discussion might be with your line manager. It might be with other people in your organization. It might be with other researchers if you're working on an academic constitution. So again, the idea here that you develop your ideas is not always just you by yourself. You use other people's insights, knowledge, experiences to inform what you're doing. Once you've done all of that, you're then rephrasing your research problem. Okay, that's when you're really drilling it down to get into the how, the what, the why, or the declarative statement. Okay, you're trying to get into the very specifics, the nitty-gritty of the area. So what's the criteria of a good research problem? Well, firstly, it has to be clear and ambiguous. By reading your research question, I should know exactly what you're going to be researching. I shouldn't be left scratching my head thinking, I don't know what this person's doing. So if you came to me and you said to me you were investigating the role of the UK government and what it does with economic policy after coronavirus, well, that's not very specific because I don't know what area of UK government you're looking at. I don't know what economic policy, what sector of the economy, what do you mean by economic policy? And I don't know what you mean by the coronavirus pandemic. Are you talking about today? Are you talking about 18 months ago when the virus first started? Are you talking about 6 months ago when the restrictions were? So again, you need to be very specific. You need to give me something that's unambiguous. I need to be clear on exactly what you're doing. Ideally, your study will be empirical. You'll be going out to investigate something that is going on in the external world. It's not a conceptual study. You're not talking about theories and models. You're talking about physical, here and now, things that are going on in the external world. It should be verifiable. What do I mean by that? Well, verification. I should be able to go out there and verify what you're doing because A, you're being transparent and you've given me the research process. You've been quite clear on what you've done. And B, the area you're investigating isn't something that's secretive, okay? It's not something that's specific to, I don't know, say you work in the CIA. If you were doing something, firstly, the CIA wouldn't let you research them, but even if you did get approval, you did a study in the CIA, then I can't verify that study because they won't let me access, So again, it needs to be something that's verifiable. It needs to be interesting. Now you might think, what do you mean by interesting? Well, it needs to be something that's actually going to add value. It's something that we want to know. I mean, there's things in the world that we don't really care about. So you might be looking at how often can someone kick a ball in a 24-hour window? Well, who cares? It doesn't really make any sense to me. I don't really care how many times, or the world doesn't really care how many times a ball can be kicked. Okay, that's not really important. If you're doing something, do it on something interesting, something that adds value, something that can be used going forward. Something that's novel and original. So again, doing something that's already been done is pointless because someone's done it already. Yes, you might do it in a different context, but it's still been done already. It's not really adding any value, okay? Do something novel, do something original, do something that hasn't been done before. Availability of guidance, again, that can be important. So who's available to you? Who's guiding what you're doing? Who's giving you suggestions? Who's sense checking your thoughts, your research process, your thinking? You know, all these things are important. Who's giving you that guidance? So that is it for today. I think I've covered a lot today. I've introduced what research is. I've talked about research formulation. I've talked about the process, and we've just almost finished basically step one, okay? All about the research problem. How do you go from a research problem to having a research question? So that's something you should be bearing in mind for your own research project, okay? How do you actually choose an area and then define a specific research question? And I think that's it from me. Any questions from you guys for today? Anything anyone wants to ask based on today's lecture? No, no questions. Okay, well, if there isn't any questions, oh, sorry, I think someone's about to ask something. Yes.
No, it's okay. No question.
No questions? Okay.
Now.
No problem at all. That's great. Well, listen, thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully you all took away something useful, something meaningful that you can now apply going forward for your own research project. We will reconvene on Thursday afternoon. Okay, so it's not Wednesday this week, it's Thursday. Thursday the 13th, I believe, of August. Let me just double check the date. No, it's not. It's the 12th, I believe. I will see you all on Thursday, the 12th of August, and we will reconvene for the next series of lectures for research methods. Okay. Thank you very much for your time now. Bye-bye.